Before getting into the topic of this video, the life of St. Anselm, investiture controversy in England, and the primacy of Canterbury, I will apologize for the rambliness of this video. It is done without a script, just my notes, so hopefully you still find it interesting. This is hopefully to speed up the process and to make it more enjoyable for pretty much everybody involved. We'll start with the sources. It's kind of starting at the end to go forward. Well, first of all, the book that I used is by R.W. Southern called St. Anselm. Good book, definitely recommend. The sources of Anselm's life are his own writings, which I have a compilation over here on my desk called Basic Writings, which has most of his theological works, if not all of his theological works. We also have his Meditations, which are a series of independent, individual writings that he has written to give to local magnates. And they were spread around a lot in the later Middle Ages. They were the most impactful of his writings, at least right away. We have also his letters, which he saved some of. They were kind of in a rough draft. He actually, during his lifetime, he would ask people at his former establishments if they could bring him his letters, because he knew where they were, but they were usually maybe wax tablet or parchment drafts and not actual fully made letters copied like that. And his collection was seemingly made, for reasons I won't get into, by his followers after he had died, maybe a bit before he had died too. He didn't approve of it, but he didn't exactly get mad about it in ways that we'll see he did with other things. He actually did like it when other people read letters he had meant for a specific person, which is something we'll talk about in a bit. The biggest source of Anselm's life is his biographer named Eadmer. I'm just going to call him Edmer. I think that's the correct way to pronounce it. It's Eadmer. He was born about 30 years after St. Anselm in around 1060. He was an Englishman through and through. He was a child oblate, I believe, at Canterbury. In Canterbury, it was a bit different because normally cathedrals had canons under usually the Augustinian rule, but of course, in England and Ireland, earlier on, there was a more monastic foundation to their religion, to their organization, church structure, which is why perhaps Canterbury had a monastic church group instead of canons. Edinburgh was one of them. He was there in about, I believe it was 1076, when St. Anselm went and visited. And Anselm was very known for his speech, how it captivated his audience in such a way. So Edinburgh didn't forget that encounter. So when Anselm became the archbishop in 1093, for some reason or another, Anselm decided that Edmer would be his closest companion and travel with him wherever he went, and he would teach him a lot of things. So Edmer, during his time with Anselm for only 7 years, from 1093 to 1100, he took a lot of notes on parchment or wax of the things that Anselm would say in private conversation, which was something that was a little bit not so much done at the time. His conversation usually was a little more of the demeanor, perhaps, of the person, but that now it was more actual his conversation, his actual words. And Edward was a very illustrative author. He was very descriptive, and he wrote all these things in secret without Anselm knowing until 1100 during one of Anselm's exiles, which of course Edward was with him on. They were at Lyon in the Empire when Anselm asked if he could see what Edmund was writing, which he actually did pretty often, and Edmund would have given him the works and he'd get it critiqued and all, approved, changed a little bit with Anselm's advice. This time was no different, although Edmund actually did refuse at first, and then Anselm basically just said, "You'll get away from me, or you'll give me this and let me see it." But then a couple of days later, Anselm sort of cracked, and he told Edmer to destroy the writings on they're called quires. the certain type of parchment. And Edmer, dismayed that his master would make him destroy 7 years of work, he decided that he would take the liberty of first copying the quires onto different quires and then destroying the ones that Anselm told him to destroy. So he kept the writing for posterity, which actually that's the reason why Anselm wanted him to destroy it. He believed he was not a worthy person to have his writings carried on and his image to be glorified in the future, which of course, I mean, we're talking about him now, so he might have been right, but it was in his mentality that he was supposed to be repulsive, and he was supposed to think himself as repulsed in order to approach himself to God. We'll talk about that too. Now, after this, Anselm and Edmer's relationship completely tore apart. Even though Edmer did destroy the works that Anselm told him to destroy, it's possible that Anselm knew he had copied it and just didn't say anything, or we don't have record of him saying it. And so basically, Anselm began to favor other people, and Edmer was kind of left on his own, doing his other stuff in his time. He would keep this whole thing ultimately a secret, even if Anselm did know, for about 20 years until he confessed what he had done, which he did believe was a sin, to the new Archbishop Ralph of Canterbury. And as a punishment, or a penance, we could say, Archbishop Ralph told Edmer that he needed to put that confession of what he did in the preface to his work, which he decided to make into two writings. He had to decide between a vita or a historia. He kind of made both. First, the fact that he was kicked out of the entourage at that critical point in 1100 meant that he could make his story about the dealings of Anselm with the king and the pope. And he also made a vita et conversatio, which I had mentioned just now about conversation. And he made it where it was really in depth with the conversations of St. Anselm, his teachings, his similes, and also some miracles. Although Edmer seems to have not really witnessed a lot of them, they were a lot of hearsay. Even if they were happening on his exiles that Edmer was nearby, he didn't really end up seeing a lot of these. For a while, Edmer would carry on the dream of primacy of Canterbury that Anselm had tried to defend but ultimately failed. He even went to become the bishop. He was invited to become the bishop of St. Andrews in Scotland by the king up there. However, he insisted on being consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury, not that of York, which caused issues, and ultimately he was never even consecrated. He gave up that position, and he had problems for a while. He was just kind of an average monk after that, it sounds pretty basic because that's what his job was, his position in the world. However, when you go from seeing St. Anselm and being with this incredibly prolific speaker and meeting people like Urban II, Pascal II, Hugh of Dee, Hugh of Cluny, the Greeks at the Council of Bari, which we'll talk about, to just going to being your average monk, it's kind of a roller coaster, we could say. He tried his best to support that primacy of Canterbury, which was an important thing to talk about. However, he ended up giving it up at some point, and we even have his writings where he seems to say that he had been, in his youth, he had kind of been too focused on things that didn't really matter. He had clearly given up the dream of Canterbury's primacy. He did support the Immaculate Conception doctrine, which was strangely an English thing at the time. That doesn't mean it was only English. We have Chartres, for example. I hate saying it like that, Chartres in France. That city was very imbued with the Immaculate Conception and the Feast of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary in its liturgical customs, its masses, its tropes, its art. Edmer had also written a Tractatus de Conceptione Sancti Mariae, the Treatise on the Immaculate Conception, which ended up being attributed to St. Anselm. And we had people like some of the Franciscans, I think, in the 13th century who were calling this a heresy. They didn't like the Immaculate Conception at the time, some of them. And they would say, oh, well, we found this in St. Anselm, but actually it was Edmer, but it got misattributed at some point. That doesn't mean that the doctrine's wrong. It doesn't mean anything about the doctrine itself. It just means that Edmer somehow got replaced by Anselm somewhere along the way. And people did believe the Immaculate Conception was promoted by Anselm. However, Anselm himself did not support that doctrine. That's enough for the future of his life, though. We now need to go to his origins. St. Anselm was born in 1033, roughly, to minor nobility in Aosta, which is at the southern tip of Burgundy. His family was declining at the time. They were going clerical, a lot of the men becoming bishops, and due to losses, it seems like his father was just some sort of milites or a knight who had married his Anselm's mother, who was of that family who was losing ground. Early on in Anselm's life, his mother died, and he had come from his father. He probably had some kind of a lower education, and he always did dream of becoming a monk. Anselm had spiritual experiences even from his youth. Edmer, his biographer, talks about his story of him going into the mountains in Aosta, which were apparently always called the Mountains of Jupiter, which was something that was common all over Europe at the time, pretty much. The mountains would be Mountain of Jupiter. I mean, think of like Mount Olympus is probably something similar. Also, the Capetian battle cry, Montjoie Saint Denis, Montjoie. He goes into the mountain. Before he goes into the mountain, there are people outside making bread, toiling in the fields, doing laborious work. Anselm enters into the mountain, which is something that even those other traditions talk about, with going and visiting the king in the mountain. St. Anselm goes into the mountain, and he's met with God himself. God is there, who gives orders to his steward to give Anselm white bread, which we could maybe think of this. Anselm had some kinds of spiritual experiences, visions. This might be too early for one of them. I'm not really sure. I can't really tell if this actually happened or if it's just a story or had some other kind of meaning. Who knows? But the point is that this story did exist, and it is a pretty good metaphor for Anselm's life of not wanting to toil in public affairs, but always wanting, even when he was a bishop, to focus on God and be as spiritual as possible and unwavering in obedience. Anselm decided to go from town to town, like I said, across northern France. He didn't really know what to do. He didn't really know where he was going. He eventually heard of a school at Avranches, at the very western part of Normandy, where he heard of a man named Lanfranc, who was teaching. Lanfranc had a prestigious northern Italian education in law, and this helped him extensively in his teaching and his academics, where he was very rigorous, and his teaching was mostly effective in dialectic, and he had students coming to him from all over Europe. Even the Pope himself had sent clerics to Lanfranc, who was at a certain point beginning to be interested more in theology, but the Pope insisted that he needed to teach his clerks in dialectic to make them prepared for what they were going to do in their administrative lives. Lanfranc wrote a commentary on the Pauline epistles where he took certain contradictions, apparent contradictions in the writings of St. Paul, and he put them together and he worked out solutions. This was something that would be a literary style in the schools for a while after this. He didn't seem to use any patristics for a while until it seems that he added them in after the fact. He also used a certain abbreviation for references on the side, like for Augustine, he put .a. which that exact notation was actually found later and even in other writings in Canterbury and in England and spread from there, and it had its origins in Lanfranc's epistle commentary. He made a school at Bec at a certain point, which was near Rouen, in the Diocese of Rouen. He opened the school there, and it had great attraction for a lot of people, just like he had at Avranches. He was also a collector of books. It had a library with a lot of St. Augustine in it, which will be important at Bec for St. Anselm. In 1059, the new Pope Nicholas II, either during or probably after Christmas 1059, had a council for dealing with various things, as popes did. One of them was the controversy of Berengar of Tours, which this might have actually been after the council. But basically, Berengar of Tours was saying that the Eucharist was not the. He didn't disagree with real presence per se, but he did not believe what we would call transubstantiation. He didn't believe that the bread transformed into the body of Christ. He believed that it remained, but that the presence of Christ became full in it spiritually, which maybe that has some echoes later. He got this because of his grammatical approach to the mass, the speech in the mass, where the priests, especially if you've ever been to a Latin mass, you might have seen something that says like "Hoc est enim corpus meum." That sentence, "Hoc est enim corpus meum." If you say "hoc" at the beginning of the sentence, in order for the sentence to have meaning, Berengar said, that "hoc" must mean the same thing at the end of the sentence as it did at the beginning. So "hoc est enim corpus meum." But this "hoc" is bread. Est enim corpus meum. It should still be bread. That was kind of Berengar's whole thing, which obviously the church had to reject, and it did. And Lanfranc, who was there at the time, he was able to be called on to go against this. He used, for the first time, we believe, the idea of the actually Aristotelian separation between substance and accidents, that the accidents stayed the same, but the substance changed and became the body of Christ, which was already believed, obviously, but it hadn't been explained in such a way, in this Aristotelian way, before Aristotelianism really took off in Western Europe, like it did in, like say, Aquinas' time, where that was pretty much his thing. At the council, Berengar was made to burn his works, and he was made to apparently sign a document of a confession of faith in the church's perspective, the correct perspective, we could say. However, he would deny doing this later when he went back to his position, when Lanfranc confronted him on it. That's not really the topic today, though. What's also important about this council is why Lanfranc was even there in the first place, which was probably to negotiate a legitimization of the marriage between William the Conqueror, who was not yet the Conqueror, he was still just William the Bastard at the time, with his wife Matilda of Flanders, who was apparently related to him too closely, and their marriage was therefore illicit. Both sides had something to gain from this. If the Pope could secure his southern border by a Norman alliance, don't forget the Sicilians, Sicily, Naples down there was Norman occupied. The Romans were down there. They were working. It wasn't totally Norman occupied yet, but they were the strong man down there. So the Pope would, of course, love to have that alliance, and William also needed that legitimacy, especially if he wanted to have big endeavors to, say, conquer England in a few years, which I'm not sure if there's much of a plan. I haven't honestly studied that myself, so I can't say. But the Pope did agree to legitimize the marriage, but he gave the condition that the William must, as a penance for his illicit marriage, he must found a convent and a monastery in his lands, which he did at Caen, Caen, Caen. And in a couple of years, Lanfranc would become the first abbot of Caen. Of course, between 1059 and 1063 was a time where Lanfranc was able to teach Anselm a lot of things and to really ground him. In fact, Anselm wasn't even going to become a monk at first. He actually didn't know, and we can already see a bit of his ultimate obedience, where he had asked Lanfranc and basically just said, "Look, I don't know what to do. I could go back to my hometown in Alistan. I could run this hospital that my family is sort of involved with. I can become a hermit, which wasn't unheard of at the time. People did it all the time. I'm a hermit. I can become a priest. I can become a clerk. I could become a monk. And Lanfranc didn't want to deal with this decision himself, so they both deferred it to the Bishop of Rouen at the time, who said to Anselm that he should become a monk. So he became a monk. Anselm's first work, which is pretty different from the rest of them, was a De Grammatico, which just dealt with sort of your average banal school stuff, you could say. Not really that important for the story. After this writing, though, 1063, after the departure of his friend and mentor Lanfranc, Anselm kind of goes quiet. He seems to have done a ton of reading in this period on Augustine, mostly. He became incredibly imbued with Augustine's writings and his mentality, to such a point that at a certain point he wouldn't even cite the sources. Like when he wrote his Monologion, he sent it to Lanfranc at Caen to get his opinion, and Lanfranc basically says, "Where are your sources?" And Anselm doesn't agree to even put the sources. He just says they're in Augustine. They're there. So he was kind of making himself mentally as Augustine as possible in a certain sense, and just not digging for the citations anywhere. Because he knew they existed, he just didn't care to look for them. And he didn't think it was necessary. Anselm seems to have been less optimistic than Augustine. His origins of meditation being that you were supposed to look inwards, discover that you are a horrible, insignificant, decrepit, nasty soul before God, to realize that you are such a nasty, decrepit soul, then to use that knowledge to even know yourself more as the decrepit soul, to delight in others seeing you as decrepit and as a bad, just bad, sinful, and then to be free in that would give you freedom, because you wouldn't be so worried about maybe other people's regard towards you or your image. You could just obey God in ultimate humility, which was one of Anselm's biggest focuses, behind obviously obedience being number one. He absorbed the Bible as well and used it with an incredibly deep and understanding. His worldview was a bit different because he was not in the same. Augustine lived in a world where Augustine himself was not even a Christian for a while. He was a Manichaean. Augustine had to become a Christian, and he knew of people who weren't Christians. Whereas, especially at this time, St. Anselm didn't really have this. Everyone around him was a Christian. He didn't have the same sense of, you know, Hannibal at the gates, so to speak. He lived in a Christian worldview. He lived in his monastery, and that was that, which sort of restricted him in his worldview. However, it didn't make him dumber or anything like that. Anselm wrote, like I was just saying, his meditations, which kind of start like that, with knowing yourself and seeing how sinful you are. His meditations are online. You can find them online. On I forget the site. I can look at it really quickly. It is CCEL. I forget what that stands for, but that's what it is. Anselm wrote those meditations usually for aristocratic benefactors or contacts that he had. Growing up to this time, there were these sort of bland Carolingian era prayers that were purposely left that way, apparently, as Southern in his book says. They were a reaction to how rough it was that the Irish were being too elaborate. And so there was kind of a counter push. But at this time, there was a counter push, making them more, to make them even more elaborate. And Anselm took this to the core. Usually, the meditations could be directed towards a saint, identifying a certain sin of the saint with the saint of the person in question, and then highlighting the redemption of the saint because the saint's a saint for a reason, and then asking for the saint's intercession. So you could say, like St. Peter, for example, if you're someone who has denied the Lord many times and you feel bad, then you can see that you have denied the Lord 3 times, more than 3 times. You can look at St. Peter, who denied the Lord 3 times, like he did in the Gospels, and you can identify yourself with that, but then also recognize that saint's redemption and ask for that saint's prayers for you. And usually there would be a characteristic of the saint's life, like for St. Peter, binding and loosing would be emphasized. Anselm accentuated desperation of his sinful past. Of course, this tripped him up with Mary, because if Mary was supposed to not be sinning, how could he make a prayer to Mary in the same way he did it with the others? He had problems with this. And it even took him a few years to figure out what to do, because he had someone who was waiting on this, waiting on him to make a prayer in the same way. And he couldn't do it until he had to content himself with her greatness and the fact that the prayer, the prayer, like the person who praying, was inferior, and to emphasize that gap, something like that. He went that route. These meditations would be the number one imitation of later writers trying to capture the style and intensity. Nobody was able to actually capture the intensity, but the style, yes, and that made a lot of false attributions to Anselm, which only very recently have been sort of unraveled. And in fact, some of them have talked about the Immaculate Conception, which, of course, Anselm didn't believe in. And those, over time, made people, like in the later Middle Ages, they said, St. Anselm, he believed in the Immaculate Conception, but he didn't. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means he didn't believe in it. In 1076, Anselm finished the Monologion, which he had written, as he says, to appease his students who were eager for reasons for their faith. He had first called it De Ratione Fide, and he sent it to Lanfranc asking for a name and for approval. Of course, Lanfranc, his mentality, didn't like it because it didn't have sources. Anselm responded just saying that it was full of Augustine, and that I guess it should just be obvious that he got everything there, and that nothing in the writing could not be found elsewhere. This changes his form of reasoning here a little bit from self-abnegation to focusing on the divine nature. However, the first was responsible and necessary for the second. In order to discover the divine nature and the reason for your faith, you also had to realize that you had to go through the spiritual preparation first of seeing yourself as this lowly creature. Faith comes before understanding, but understanding gives a happiness or a warmth to the faith in the church's beliefs, even though. So if you already believe and you don't understand, Anselm would just say, okay, be quiet and just believe. Even if you don't really get it, just believe it because the church says to believe it. However, if you are capable of understanding higher things, he says that you ought to, and that it will give a warmth and a happiness to your faith. He wrote the Proslogion shortly thereafter, which was more of an original thought. It was a comparison of the greatest being in the mind, not outside of it, and then the greatest being in the mind that exists outside of it. And since existing in real life is better than not, it's a contradiction otherwise. This would mean that the fool denying God's existence doesn't even know what God means, because God means that you have this thing that exists. It has to exist as the greatest possible thing. And if you disagree with that, then that means you don't understand what God means, and you don't understand what anything means, and you're a fool. Which is why, as the Bible says, the fool says in his heart there's no God. Shortly after finishing his Proslogion, In 1078, he became abbot of the monastery of Bec. He apparently did not want to have this position, but he ultimately accepted due to his concept of obedience. He was in charge of more administrative tasks, and the funny thing is that he was actually pretty bad at being an administrator. He was pretty bad at his position in terms of running the place. What he was able to do was get benefactors and start new monasteries, new dependencies, priories, especially in England. However, he always trusted in God, which is good, but he would say things like he trusted God during hardship and he wouldn't do anything to solve, say, hunger if they didn't have enough food at the monastery. And he would just wait for something to happen. And usually it would be like Lanfranc would give a certain amount of, you know, funds or food to save him, or somebody would. It happened a couple of times. And this would also happen in Canterbury when he became the archbishop at a certain point, where he would sell the plates, the fine china of the monks, and they're like, "Why did you sell all this stuff? You could have done this a different way." And then he had to kind of give them money for it instead, as in recompense for what he had given away. Anyway, that's too far ahead. Um, yeah, so he was able to get the foundations building around the area, but he was not good at administration, and he knew it, I'm sure. And everyone around him kind of knew it, but they still obeyed, and he was still incredibly influential to his people around him. Up until 1089, he did that, but in 1089, there was something special that happened. A certain Roscelin, who was sort of like a, oh gosh, I'm so Gen Z, I'm sorry, but the rage baiter of the 11th century, right? He would he would he was worse than like Peter Abelard a couple of decades later. He would anger people and get into all these debates and things. Basically, he got to a certain point where he believed that all three members of the Trinity were incarnate at the incarnation. And he accused Anselm of basically believing the same thing. Because Anselm had said that just as white, just, and grammaticus, or like well readness, we could say, are all things that can describe a man, so Father, Son, and Holy Spirit can all be used to describe God. And Anselm basically said, "Hey, this is what I think." And Anselm, of course, denies this and accuses Roscelin of tritheism. But Anselm had to write his Incarnatione Verbi, on the incarnation of the word, to counter this, which he only was able to finish while he was archbishop. Roscelin had made the accusation. He laid off for a little bit, but then in 1092 he came back to it. And that's when Anselm, when he was archbishop, he had to write against it because it was heresy. He was being accused of heresy, basically. He was able to get out of it, but it did cause some doctrinal issues that he had to sort of rethink. Anselm's concept of freedom was an incredibly Christian one, and one that entirely counters our so-called fake freedom today. We can just do whatever we want, which isn't necessarily bad all the time, but it doesn't exactly mean what we mean. So, for example, if you want one food for dinner versus a different food for dinner, that's not really freedom as Anselm sees it. Maybe he would even say you're, a servant of your appetite, but who knows? He believed that since sin is servitude, as scripture says, that means that non-sin is freedom. But since that's negative, he made it be that the power to carry out what our human nature is for is freedom. And since our human nature is to follow God and to seek God and to enjoy God, that means that our freedom is to seek and follow God. If we do not seek God, our illusion of choice it means it's an illusion. We've already lost our way before we've even made a choice at all. The devil with perfect knowledge rejected God with full knowledge, therefore he is lost. But since man sees something as good, but is deceived, even under false pretenses of freedom, he has the right to make a right choice and he is still redeemable. There's also a huge elephant in the room when it comes to St. Anselm, and this has to be talked about, is that modernist, leftist, so-called historians will tout the fact that Anselm was this pioneer, this they call him gay. Let's just be frank. They call him homosexual because of his letters. And when you read the letters, they do seem a little bit personal, a little more than, especially today, we'd be comfortable even saying. But this doesn't mean that Anselm was a homosexual. It has to do with his views on the world. Anselm's ideas of friendship and freedom were similar in their basis, their theological basis, in that God would give both of them in heaven perfectly, and we would all be friends, and we would all be perfectly free, and as we can all see God in the fullest extent, because he's right there, he's present, we're in his presence, beatific vision. They both can be experienced on earth not as symbols, but as faint hints towards it, so to speak, but only if properly ordered. Both had their culmination in the monastic life and obedience, and this is expressed in his letters. One example of such a letter is he wrote this to a nun, which kind of goes against the whole gay thing because he wrote these to men and women. Probably the daughter of his friend, the Earl of Chester. He wrote, I love you, and I love your soul as my own. That is to say, I love it in the measure in which, by deserving to enjoy God in this life, your soul will enjoy him in the life to come. It is this that I love, and this that I desire for you. Wherefore I urge and advise you as a dearest daughter not to delight in secular things, because no one can love secular and eternal blessing simultaneously. Let all your conversation be in the cloister, not in the world. This world is nothing to you, nothing but dung. If you wish to be a nun and spouse of God, do not visit your relatives. They do not need your advice, nor you theirs. Your way of life is cut off from theirs. Let all your desire be for God. So it's a call to renunciation, and it is a communion of wills in the service of God to those who had made that renunciation, as Southern says. You could be Anselm's close friend only if you shared in his monastic beliefs on love, friendship, discipline. He didn't have the same warmness to anyone but these monks. Now, some of the letters do talk about him, say, hugging or kissing, but kisses are not inherently, it doesn't signify instantly that he's a homosexual, because kisses at the time were actually fairly common, as like something says, the culmination of certain things. For example, in feudal agreements, in homage, there would usually be kisses. There would be in the mass. I think there also was in penitence, reconciling penitence for the initiation of monks. Even today, if you go to the Latin Mass, I haven't seen it, but apparently they do have also. There's a kiss of peace, so it doesn't mean that he's kissing this person affectionately out of sexual love. Which, if you read everything else Saint Anselm believes stands for, it's absolutely not that, right? He actually despised sodomy and saw it as a grotesque thing in his worldview. Anselm believed, like all monks at the time, that the cloister was the place to find God and the best way and the safest way to reach heaven. So he believed that sort of like the battle was already won. If you were in the monastery, you were already on that route. Yet some people would try to leave, like some people who were, for example, at the Norman conquest, there were some noble women who didn't want to get married to the new nobility, or they were seeking refuge. So they sought that refuge in monasteries, in convents. Even if they didn't make a profession of faith, if they just put on the the the, the veil, Anselm would say, I think this is the same case with the letter that I just read. He'd basically say, no, you put on the veil, even if it's just a shroud of a hint towards a commitment towards the monastic life, he thought that that was it. You were in the monastery, done. Even though Lanfranc permitted at his time, when he was archbishop, that these women could go back out and do their own thing. He had to, Anselm was telling the bishops and all that to basically not let them leave and then trying to convince the women. He also convinced people who were wanting to go visit their family, say, or people who wanted to go on the crusade for some monks. Some monks maybe wanted to go on a crusade, or at least to be chaplain. And he would say, no, you can't go to the Holy Land. You need to stay here in the monastery. This is where you belong, under perfect obedience to your abbot. And that's where we need to talk about his obedience, which was his probably his biggest, I don't know if it's exactly a virtue, but his strength, his emphasis was on absolute obedience, no matter what, to whatever is above you. And this obedience and freedom in that obedience, which was the pinnacle of Anselmian thought, would play an interesting and paradoxical role in his election as archbishop. Anselm had gone on a trip to England to survey his lands, but also to reconfirm the privileges that his monastic lands and his priories were endowed with, since William the Conqueror had died, and the new king, William Rufus, he was busy currently though in the north, but he was now the king. And so at December, around Christmas, there was supposed to be an assembly, and there was, but they never actually talked about it. However, sometime later in Gloucestershire, the king started dying, and Anselm, who was still in England, still waiting for his audience with the king, who was now going to die. Anselm was just working, by the way. He was working on some writings at the time. He was actually working on Cor Deo Solo. And anyway, he goes to the king and gives him his last rites. He was called on by the king to do so. The king knew he was around. And Anselm seems to have maybe made it a condition of his penance to name a new archbishop, because the archbishopric had been vacant for a few years after Lanfranc had died, because, of course, the king has everything to gain and little to lose from having a vacancy in an archbishopric because he gets the spoils. But basically, the king looks at Anselm and goes, "You are the next archbishop." And he supposedly grabs the bishop's staff and he grabs Anselm's hand and tries to put it in his hand. And of course, Anselm is astonished in his, not really timidness, but his obedience to the monastic life. He doesn't want to do it, and he tries not to do it. But then the other bishops that are around him at the time, at the deathbed of the king, all force his hand around the staff, and then they carry him away into the cathedral, where he's now supposed to be archbishop of all of Canterbury, and therefore supposed to be primate of all of England. Of course, Anselm, he had to accept this because this was the right thing to do for God's flock. He knew that the people needed an archbishop. He knew that the monks needed an archbishop. So the right thing to do, even being commanded by the king to do so, was to become the archbishop. And so being a monk, continuing in his old life, would have actually been him choosing his own way instead of being obedient to his superiors and to a calling to serve the people of God. Therefore, he had to take it. The monks at Bec were pretty suspicious. They didn't really like this. They thought, since he was so adamant on the fact of monastic life and on its function, that now he seemed like a hypocrite. But he couldn't really do anything about it. He gave them advice on picking a new abbot. He got also the permission of Henry of Normandy, and he became archbishop. That incident I just described, by the way, happened on March 6th, 1093. 6 months later, in September, on the 25th, he was enthroned, and on December 4th, he was consecrated. Now, here's the second elephant in the room, is that he was not elected canonically. He was invested by a king and then afterwards he did homage to the king. Now, the homage part isn't a problem because there was no prohibition of homage, at least yet. But in 1078, Pope Gregory VII had forbidden, under pain of excommunication, anyone who invested a cleric. Of course, this makes some interesting discussion because it seems like maybe those ecclesiastical laws coming from Rome weren't exactly as binding as they seemed, or they were not always as known or made known as much. How was it that Anselm, almost 20 years later, did not know? Maybe he just didn't care? And what's most peculiar of all about this is that Anselm, as we know, he didn't want to even become Abbot of Bec, and he certainly did not want to become Archbishop of Canterbury, which was shown by his letters, and he said to the Pope, like, take me out of this slavery, I don't want to be doing this. And he even used his grounds, his inefficiency as an administrator, which was absolutely true, let's face it. But he never ever said once that he was illegitimately invested and therefore he shouldn't be archbishop. He never did it. Even when he went to the Pope to seek a renunciation, to seek a resignation, he never said this, which is very peculiar. There was still one more step, though, for his installation as archbishop. It was the delivery and acceptance of the pallium, which is the sort of triangle thing that a bishop wears around his neck. It had to be received within a year of his consecration, which would be December of 1094. Of course, that date came and passed, and by the way, Anselm still never made a fuss about this. By that time, Anselm was posted as the defender of the south of the kingdom, because the king, in fact, William Rufus, because he did not end up dying, he survived that deathbed incident. He was in the north, busy, so Anselm was responsible for defending the south in case of an invasion, which is pretty interesting. You have this monk who's now archbishop and has to defend the port cities of the Kingdom of England. And when the papal legate came to England to give him the pallium, Anselm had to tell him no. He had to say, no, I'm too busy in my position. I can't go over to you and receive the pallium. Because he had to obey the king, first and foremost, but also because, and this is something to do with primatial jurisdiction, is that Anselm believed it firmly that he was not supposed to have any other papal legate in England because he believed that he himself was the legate. And this was traditionally held for some time. Of course, there was no old documentation for this, and that showed when it was sought for in the administrative and documentary future. And this legate, Walter of Albano, had some other accusations. He accused Anselm of being invested by a heretic because technically William Rufus had not yet recognized either, I believe it was Clement III, or Urban II, the actual pope at the time. So Anselm denied this, and then Walter, the legate, proposed a council, which Anselm also rejected because he believed firmly that a king had to be involved in the convocation process, which just goes to show you how conservative Anselm was. And he didn't necessarily believe that these jurisdictions of the new reform era, like holding councils without royal approval, were sort of okay. Or he didn't do them. He liked to act with the proper authority, and if he didn't judge that the proper authority was had, he didn't act. The relationship between Anselm and King Rufus was always sour-tempered. It even happened where the knights that Anselm had furnished as obviously a landowner were denigrated by the king. Anselm just couldn't really handle he couldn't handle it. He just didn't like it. He didn't like the controversy of investiture. So he went to the Pope without the king's permission, because he kept dragging his feet on approving or not approving, in October of 1097. Anselm had seemingly been too trusting for too long that the king would come to an agreement. But when the writing was on the wall that it wasn't going to happen, Anselm had to just leave. He went to Cluny, then to Lyon, where he met Hugh of D, who was the papal legate of France, which Anselm was horrendously against papal legates in England, but not obviously against this one in France, which just kind of shows that he wasn't against the papal cause entirely. He was fine with legates, he just believed that he was the legate to England. Then Anselm went with his entourage, sometimes even disguised as monks to not draw too much attention. They went to Rome, met with the Pope, and with the Pope they went to Bari, which is sort of the eastern tip of Italy, to have a conference with the Greeks about the Filioque, where Anselm was even invited to speak, and I believe he wrote a document, which we no longer have, unfortunately. After that, they went back to Rome, and there was another council, the Council of 1099, around the tomb of St. Peter. There were still pilgrims going up to the tomb during the council, even, so it was pretty noisy, a lot of hurly-burly, but they were still able to hold a council, and Bishop of Lucca, with a loud voice, read the canons that didn't really talk about Anselm's case too much, but when he did, he actually had a side tangent outburst about the fact that Anselm's case hadn't really been dealt with, and then he continued when the Pope told him to pipe down, basically. And the Pope then stood up and declared all excommunicate who were invested by a layman or did homage to a layman, both of things that Anselm had done with William Rufus. Anselm didn't show much change of mind towards the Hildebrandine reform, but it was part of his own mentality of personal obedience to apply the two 1099 decrees to a T. On August 2nd of 1100, William Rufus died, and his brother 3 days later was coronated as Henry I of England. Anselm did not find out until September, but he went right away and arrived shortly afterwards because he was invited to come back. He did not, however, he obeyed to a T as much as he could the decrees of 1099, which meant that he would not be invested nor give homage for his lands to Henry, which would be the result of his next exile in April of 1103. I'll just mention this second exile now. He went to go to the Pope, and so did some of King Henry's messengers. They both arrived about the same time, and they discussed what was going to happen. They made an agreement. Then Anselm left, but then the king's messengers stayed a little bit longer, and they made an agreement that would basically mean a compromise. And the Pope had already been pretty much compromising before this time, and Anselm kind of already knew it, where there would be no investiture, but there would be homage. And Anselm did not know this right away, not exactly, until the messengers of the king caught up to him at Piacenza in Italy and let him know with a letter stating that this was a new situation. Anselm wrote back to the Pope, and even the letter kind of accused Anselm of being a little fussy, which Anselm couldn't have appreciated given he was obeying so strictly to the rules that the Pope had actually made. Obviously, because of the 1099 decrees against investiture and against homage, some of the king's ministers had already been excommunicated, and the king had not been excommunicated yet, which is why Anselm, even when he was in exile, he had already started to do the process where you had to have, according to canon law, you had to have 3 summonses that would be ignored. At a certain point, though, he lost patience and went to L'Aigle, which is around the border of Normandy and Blois, and he talked to Henry's sister, Adela of Blois, who was the countess, and warned her that the king was about to be excommunicated. Of course, she warned him, and then he came down to L'Aigle, and they came to an agreement. However, the real reason that Anselm stopped the excommunication threat was not because of the investiture controversy. It was because the king had, before he left, taken away his property, his funds, his rights to his possessions. So here the king gave it back, and Anselm relieved the king of pending excommunication, which just goes to show again how little Anselm really cared about the politics of the Gregorian reforms. He didn't think of it like that. He just wanted to obey what was given to him. But of course, in terms of this excommunication, he could not suffer any kind of detriment to his primatial jurisdiction as primate of Britain, of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. He believed he was in charge, and anything less would be a detriment to the God ordained order that made it this way. Anselm firmly believed, and this was the doctrine of the times, that he stood in persona of Augustine of Canterbury. Basically, if this had been given to his predecessor, then it was irrevocable, given to a saint, in that he stood, just like every other bishop or abbot, even like the Pope, for example, as the successor of St. Peter. He was given that authority he had by Christ, and that every single Pope after St. Peter had that authority because he was acting in persona St. Peter. Likewise, he was acting in persona St. Augustine of Canterbury, which meant that any detriment would be basically an insult to that saint in heaven and be maybe even damnable if he didn't correct the fault because it was disrupting God's order. And as you could read in Cornelius Homo, disrupting God's order is what sin is by definition. But alas, 1105, 1106, the people who had done homage and had been invested by the king were their positions were confirmed and they were no longer excommunicated. Anselm was eventually free to come back after a quick illness. In September 1106, he came back, and the king was fighting at the time in Normandy, so he could only come back in August of 1107, which is when the Concordat of London happens, which pretty much confirms what the Pope had already written about a year and a half prior, which pretty much ended, for this time, the investiture controversy in England, which was that, like I've said a couple of times, but just to make it clear, now there was some more freedom, but there was, of course, kingly approval in elections. The archbishop of whichever archbishop, supposed to be Canterbury for Anselm's mind, would invest whichever bishop or monk, abbot, and the king would then have that cleric, that clergy do homage to him for his lands. This is actually pretty similar to the Concordat of Worms, which would basically infeudate all of the German bishops and abbots and lead to the kind of disintegration of the empire. Didn't seem to happen the same way in England, though. Anselm had himself a certain respect for Anglo-Saxon culture and custom, liturgical custom, from the time before the conquest. When he was still abbot of Bec, there was an unruly monk in Canterbury called Osbern, who Lanfranc sent to Bec to learn discipline from Anselm. And when he was there, Anselm and Osbern quickly became friends, and Osbern made Anselm share some of his sympathy for Anglo-Saxon customs and liturgical culture. He told him that many of the saints' feast days had been suppressed, namely that of Saint Elphege, who had died in 1012. He died because he refused to pay the Danegeld, and the Danes just killed him because of it. Since Lanfranc thought that he might not have been a true martyr, he was suppressed in the calendar after the conquest. Lanfranc insisted that he might not have been a true martyr, and so Osbern told Anselm this. And Anselm decided to come to Osbern's defense and Elphage's defense, and made the claim that since justice is truth under another mode, and if Elphege died for justice, that it was unjust to pay the Danegeld. And that would mean that he died for truth, which would make him a martyr. And apparently Lanfranc was entirely moved by this. He was totally subjugated to Anselm's reasoning and decided to bring it back. Under Anselm, the interest in pre-conquest saints would flourish, and there would also be grave investigations of the saints to see what was buried inside with them. Like I said before, as Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm believed, like other people believed, that he as Archbishop was acting in persona of Augustine of Canterbury, who had been given his rights by Gregory the Great. Any loss of land or privilege at any level or jurisdiction, whether that's his archbishop jurisdiction being relegated, or even just parish churches being taken over by knights, was an offense to the saint and to divine order, because God had ordered the world thus, and the saint had received these gifts, and also that saint was sort of present in the person of St. Anselm. His claim to primacy originated in custom, and he surely was a product of a world based on custom and precedent, rather than the new 11th, 12th century where administration and documentation was becoming much more important. And we see that with forgeries, which in this case didn't go very far. In 1120, after Anselm was gone for 11 years and the situation was hopeless, the monks supposedly found the supporting documents after an extensive search. This was reported in some chronicles that they searched in the cupboards and in the closets, and voila, they found the documents that proved the primacy over all of the British Isles of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course, they were immediately found to be forgeries, and no one trusted it. It was just the last-ditch effort, which kind of makes sense now. The last-ditch effort was to get with the program, get with the ages, and to go to documentation. Doing that, it failed. And they even tried again later on in the middle of the 13th century, where apparently they were laughed out of the papal court for bringing forgeries. Anselm believed, according to custom also, that he was himself the papal legate, like I already said. He made a deal with the Pope that there would be no legates during Anselm's lifetime, which was only a temporary win, but obviously a permanent loss. He tried to push primacy on other parts of the Isles, namely Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. He succeeded in Wales, where he compelled the bishops by deposition, and one of them gave obedience and was able to maintain his position. And this apparently until the 20th century held. In Ireland, he got one bishop besides Dublin to give obedience, but after Anselm had died, there were 4 archbishoprics propped up in Ireland, which made any hope of a Canterbury primacy dead. He had a temporary win when he compelled the new Archbishop of York, Thomas II, nephew of the previous Thomas, with papal order to give obedience, lest a divided nation fall. But this did not succeed for very long. Anselm also held that he had the right to hold councils with royal collaboration. He wanted one for a while after his consecration, but he only got it in 1102 at Michaelmas, where he had laymen and clergy attend to witness and to understand what the canons would be. Importantly, he enforced clerical celibacy and deposed all priests with wives or concubines who did not get rid of them. He wrote a letter to Bishop Herbert of Thetford, who was wary of this, that there would be shortages in the priesthood. Anselm told him that, well, first of all, remember Anselm had this absolute obedience thing where any slight compromise would be unacceptable, and this must have been how he felt even with the investiture controversy solution, the Concordat of London, where the 1099 decrees had been half reversed. Anselm, of course, since he was in charge here, would allow none of it. And he said that monks, I'm assuming that he was talking about priest monks, because some of the monks obviously were priests, that they could be employed to fill some of the gaps in saying masses or hearing confessions. So that's the end of this video about St. Anselm. Rambly, like I said. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully it was interesting enough in this format. I'm not sure if I'd continue to do it. I think scripting is easier, but well, it takes more time, but it is easier in the long run. It makes for a shorter video that people would probably appreciate. But maybe this has some other unseen benefit. Thanks for listening if you are here, and goodbye.